Miss Dodds spun towards me with a murderous look in her eyes. My knees were jelly. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the sword. She snarled, "Die, honey!" and she flew right at me. Absolute terror ran through my body. I did the only thing that came naturally. I swung the sword. The metal blade hit her and passed clean through her body as if she were made of water. Miss Dodds was a sandcastle in a powder fan. She exploded like yellow powder, vaporized on the spot, leaving nothing but the smell of sulfur and a dying screech and a chill of evil in the air, as if those two glowing red eyes were still watching me. I was alone. There was a ballpoint pen in my hand. Mr. Bruner wasn't there. Nobody was there but me. My hands were still trembling. My lunch must have been contaminated with magic mushrooms or something. Had I imagined the whole thing? I went back outside. It started to rain. Grover was sitting by the fountain, a museum map tented over his head. Nancy Bobbitt was still standing there, soaked from her swim in the fountain, grumbling to her ugly friends. When she saw me, she said, "I hope Miss Kerr whipped your butt." I said, "Who?" Our teacher, duh." I blinked. We had no teacher named Miss Kerr. I asked Nancy what she was talking about. She just rolled her eyes and turned away. I asked Grover where Miss Dodds was. He said, "Who?" But he paused first, and he wouldn't look at me, so I thought he was messing with me. "Not funny, man," I told him. "This is serious." Thunder boomed overhead. I saw Mr. Bruner sitting under his red umbrella reading his book, as if he never had moved. I went over to him. He looked up, a little distracted. That would be my pen. Please bring your own when writing utensil in the future, Mr. Jackson." I handed Mr. Bruner his pen. I hadn't even realized I was still holding it. "Sir," I said, "where's Miss Dodds?" He stared at me blankly. "Who?" "The other chaperone, Miss Dodds, the pre-algebra teacher." He frowned and sat forward, looking at me mildly concerned. "Percy, there is no Miss Dodds on this trip. As far as I know, there has never been a Miss Dodds at Yancey Academy. Are you feeling all right?" Chapter 2. Three old ladies knit the socks of death. I was used to the occasional weird experience, but usually they were over quickly. This 24-hour, 7 hallucination was more than I could handle. For the rest of the school year, the entire campus seemed to be playing some kind of trick on me. The students acted as if they were completely and totally convinced that Miss Kerr, a perky blonde woman who I had never seen in my life until she got on our bus at the end of the field trip, had been our pre-algebra teacher since Christmas. Every so often I would spring a Miss Dodds reference on somebody just to see if I could trip them up, but they would stare at me like I was psycho. It got so that I almost believed them, that Miss Dodds had never existed. Almost. But Grover couldn't fool me. When I mentioned the name Dodds to him, he would hesitate, then claim that she didn't exist. But I knew he was lying. Something was going on. Something had happened at the museum. I didn't have much time to think about it during the days, but at night, the visions of Miss Dodds with talons and leathery wings would wake me up in a cold sweat. The freak weather continued, which didn't help my mood. One night, a thunderstorm blew out the windows in my dorm room. A few days later, the biggest tornado ever spotted in Hudson Valley touched down only 50 miles from Yancey Academy. One of the current events we studied in social studies class was the unusual number of small planes that had gone down in sudden squalls in the Atlantic that year. I started feeling cranky, irritable most of the time. My grades slipped from D's to F's. I got into more fights with Nancy Bobbitt and her friends. I was sent out in the hallway almost every class. Finally, when our English teacher, Mr. Nicole, asked me for the millionth time while I was too lazy to study for spelling tests, I snapped. I called him an old sot. I wasn't even sure what it meant, but it sounded good. The headmaster sent my mom a letter the following week, making it official. I would not be invited back to Yancey next year. Fine, I told myself, just fine. I was homesick. I wanted to be with my mom in our little apartment on the Upper East Side, even if I had to go to public school and put up with the obnoxious stepfather and his stupid poker parties. And yet, there were things I miss at Yancey. The view of the woods out my dorm window, the Hudson River out in the distance, the smell of pine trees. I miss Grover, who'd be a good friend of mine. Even if he was a little strange, I worried how he'd survive next year without me. I'd miss Latin class, too. Mr. Bruner's crazy tournament days, and his faith that I could do well. As exam week got closer, Latin was the only test I studied for. I hadn't forgotten what Mr. Bruner had told me about this subject being life and death for me. I wasn't sure why, but I started to believe him. The evening before my final, I got so frustrated I threw the Cambridge Guide to Greek Mythology across my dorm room. Words had started swimming off the page, circling in my head, the letters doing 180s as if they were riding skateboards. There was no way I was going to remember the difference between Chiron and Charon, or Polydikes and Polydeuces, and conjuncturing those Latin verbs. Forget it. I paced the room, feeling like ants were crawling around inside my shirt.